What I'll do today is talk about apples and go through proper names, common apples, and names for apples and names about apples. This is a very, very mixed methodology presentation. I'll do a little bit of scientific names. I'll talk about the biology of naming. I'll talk about classifications of names of apples, and I'll also talk about people who are associated with apples, and we now tend to associate their names with apples, and a little bit about saving heirloom apples, which is also related to saving their names. Okay, so first, the history of naming apples and the scientific nomenclature behind it. Scientific name, the Rosaceae. Subfamily, which is the palm fruits, along with the pear, the quince, and the medlar. We seldom run into medlars now, quince sometimes, and a lot of people who study apples also study pears. The genus is Malus. There are all kinds of different subspecies. They believe that apples originated in Asia Minor, near the Kazakhstan region now. There are also all kinds of European and North American crab apples. You wouldn't want to try and eat them. And today's apple, the kind you would buy at a store or a fruit stand, is called the Malus domestica. Okay, little bit about the difference between anonymous apples and named apples. So it goes back to the question of why are apples known by name? And I was fascinated this morning with Veronica's presentation about naming of lilacs. It made me want to visit your university garden in Moscow, because you said that you had thousands of different lilacs. They tell us that there are probably 10,000 or 15,000 varieties of apples. And I'll show you for a minute, look at me instead of the screen for a moment, why there are so many. So here's your apple. This is a gala apple, just from a bag in the refrigerator. If you cut it this way, and some of you have probably done this at some point, you end up with a star. And that 5-point star has 5 different seeds in it. Every single one of those seeds in every single apple on every single tree is going to produce a different fruit. So I think that one of the reasons that apples came to be known by name is that some fruits became so popular, they named them and they wanted to hold onto them, because you can never get a true plant by planting an apple seed. You have to plant a clone. You have to do clonal propagation. They say that they can track evidence back to the Neolithic age, and they were cultivated, meaning they found those apples that they liked and could propagate them by 2500 BCE. Pliny the Elder in the 1st century named more than 20 varieties. They were the mainstay of medieval monastery gardens and orchards. They say that in Europe, in what are known as the Dark Ages, that while the monasteries managed to preserve books, they also managed to preserve the right apples. And they were brought to North America, which has indigenous crabapple trees, but the domesticated apple were brought by some of the European settlers. Today, cider apples, cider orchards, were anonymous. People didn't care a whole lot what kind of apple grew in their cider orchard, and most settlers across the Midwest, into the north of the Midwest and a little bit toward the south of the Midwest, had to grow their own apples. Water was not always pure, but you could make cider and the fermentation would kill the bugs in the water. So everybody had their own anonymous cider orchards. But in the US, since Prohibition, apples have been produced for eating rather than drinking. And so the emphasis is on appearance and taste, and people know what they like. So they go to the grocery store, they go to the fruit stand, and they buy apples by name. And you can see below what a huge impact it has on the industry and the economy in the US and worldwide. And just a couple pictures about how the apple has become and has remained such a part of our culture. So if there are 15 or 10,000 different kinds of apples, what are we going to do about trying to classify them? And this is a non-scientific, formal study. But what I did was take a book, Brunner, who has about 200 apples, and did a cross section of his, and found that they are categorized by people, places, the characteristics of the apple, and the parents of the apple. And this one, the parents of the apple, is becoming more and more apparent as people try to cultivate particular apples. Heirloom apples, not so much. Okay, a couple of examples of each one of these. And some of these might sound familiar to you. Some of them would probably not be. Some of them would be heirlooms that are very hard to find today, although every one that I'm showing you in these lists are in existence, I guess I'd say, today. So the Baldwin was promoted by, not originally named by, but promoted by a Colonel Baldwin, and his name became attached. Cole's Quince was named for the finder of this apple, and his son described it in a fairly famous source, the American Fruit Book, as having a quince flavor. Priscilla is one of the newer varieties. It was first fruited in 1996. And hold on to this thought, once they identify an apple and grow it from a graft, it takes almost 10 years before that apple tree produces fruit. One of the reasons that so many people come together in aggregates, in apple collectives, is that it's a very time extensive and a very expensive kind of agricultural project. Okay, and this was named after the wife of one of the presidents from Purdue, Rutgers, and the University of Illinois. Name sources, places, Buckingham, for Buckingham County, although they really think it was originated in the next door neighbor county. Shenango strawberry, I like this because it's an example of a double name that combines a location name and a characteristic name. This one looks like a strawberry. I mean, not really, but kind of has that strawberry shape. Wolf River is a very big strain, and a lot of them have been cloned or borrowed from this. It was by the Wolf River, and it's one of the very few that you can propagate from seeds. Most of them you cannot. Characteristics. Black twig is covered with very dark stripes, and I'll show you an example later on in this with a picture of another kind that has very dark coloration on the outside that's called the Black Oxford. Bottle greening was one of the ones that caught my eye just because it amused me. Remember the old kinds of green glass bottles? So the name from this supposedly, a lot of this is lore, supposedly comes from farm workers' habits of hiding their liquor in green bottles in the tree. And a cheese apple is named for its shape. Okay. Sources. Now this becomes more apparent in the late 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So Golden Delicious says that it was originally named for a Grimes Golden, and that would be a Tom's Grind, so named after the person who found it. Attractive in color, so it became golden. And it's a good pollinator, so it has its own nickname. Then there's the Honeycrisp, which is a cross between a Macoun and a Honeygold. And then there's the Red Delicious, and I'll say a little bit more about the Red Delicious later, but you can see below there that once they have a mutation that's related to it, they start naming it with parts of the name. So we have a Starking Delicious, we have a Stark Spur Supreme, and a Stark Crimson Delicious. Okay. Now a little bit about people whose names are associated with apples. Since I promised you Johnny Appleseed and Granny Smith, and I tossed in another one. Okay, Johnny Appleseed. He was born just before the American Revolution in Massachusetts. He left early. He and his brother left. His family had, of course, an orchard, a cider orchard, and he took off for what became the Western Reserve and the territory in the eastern part of the Midwest. That would be Western Pennsylvania. It'd be all across the middle swath of Ohio and into the middle part of what is now Indiana. He planted nurseries and cider orchards. He didn't go around planting, cultivating apples that would have names. And what got him toward the end of his life was the temperance movement, because they argued that he should not be bringing liquor to the Midwest. He brought alcohol, not sweetness. And Michael Pollan, who wrote the big thing about the botany of desire, calls him the American Dionysius. He was actually very eccentric. You've probably seen pictures of him with a tin pot on his head for a hat, and they actually think that he did that. But he actually owned 1,200 very rich acres when he died. A little picture of him on the left. And there's one of these small towns in Ohio, Bucyrus is having its bicentennial, and they borrowed one of the maps. Okay, here's one that you weren't expecting, Corbinian Agner. He's known as the Apfelfahrer, the apple pastor. It's almost a tongue twister for me. He was born in Bavaria. He co-founded the Hohenpolding Fruit Growers Association in 1908. He had entered the seminary in 1906. And once he was ordained, he served various pastorates. He taught art and religion. He continued to cultivate fruit and lecture and publish. Because he spoke out strongly against the Nazis, he was arrested and sent to concentration camps, most of the time in Dachau. During that time, he created 4 different varieties of apples, named them, and most of the growers today named them by number until they become popular enough that they have a name associated with it. And the KZ designation comes from Konzentrationslager lager as concentration camp. Only he was able to get 4 of them smuggled out, but only one of them persisted. And in 1985, on the 100th anniversary of his birthday, the KZ3 was named the Corbinian, his first name. He also did numbers. He did over 1,000 full color illustrations to record and identify them. Here's one example in the book that he put out with it. Okay, and now as promised, Granny Smith, who was born in Sussex, England, and migrated to New South Wales with her husband. She served as the local midwife, and that in combination with, as she grew up, she just grew older, so they called her Granny. And she said that this tart green apple was one that she found from where she had been throwing the seeds from French crab apples that had come from Tasmania, just out by her creek. And she continued to work her trees, including the green ones, and local orchardist Edward Gallard planted them in quantity, and that's when they took off. It wasn't until 20 years after her death that they became famous by her name. They were selling Granny Smith's seedlings, and they were first available for export in 1895. So here's Granny Smith and Granny Smith. A little bit about naming new apples. It takes a lot of help from Mother Nature because, as you saw, in those 5 seeds, you're going to get 5 different apples. Very unreliable, but on the plus side, you get a lot of mutations, and that means you've got a lot of opportunity. Today, they're using more biotechnologies, less in terms of chemicals, and more in terms of what they do for clonal propagation and how they take rootstock and cuttings, splice them together, and from that they're able to grow apple trees. The person whom I spoke to, my personal interview, is with a Robert Sage, who owns not too far from me, maybe about 15 miles away, Sage's Apple Farm. And he told me that you plant about 10,000 seeds. Just plant them out in rows, you line them up and you number them. And that's, many of them are known by number before they turn into anything. And he says, most turn into crab apples and eventually you find a good one. And then I put down some of the desirable characteristics. You'll notice the last 2, disease and insect resistance, very important for propagation, and storage length. Some of the apples are known for being able to be harvested over a course of 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks. People like those because you can keep them longer depending on when they were first picked. Okay, so here's an example. Bob Sage belongs to the Midwest Apple Improvement Association, some of the states on the eastern end of the Midwest. And he's very proud of the fact that in the Midwest Apple Improvement Association, if they get a good apple, anybody can buy it. There's a place in New York, in Geneva. There's a place in Minnesota, up in the north, and they sell those only to state growers in New York or state growers in Minnesota. But MAIA sells them to anybody who is interested. And they charge literally cents for, for an apple, for a rootstock, because you never know. But on the other hand, they want to be able to take some of that and turn it back into their research. So they created, the first one that they created is their Evercrisp. And you'll be able to see that they picked their name. It was a Honeycrisp crossed by a Fuji. And they were able at the top now even to get a US patent on it. So fruits are one of the things that can be patented. And I'll give you a little bit of background on where it was created. And you'll notice they name almost all of them by number until they decide that it's worth it to give it a name for the public. Okay, and then a few things about saving heirloom apples. I want to say something about the Red Delicious. Red Delicious, people around the Zoom, you've tasted? How many people have tasted a Red Delicious? Okay, yeah, it's pretty popular. In fact, up until 2 or 3 years ago, it was the most popular apple in the US. It began, as almost all apple varieties do, as a mutant among yellow bellflower trees that were owned by Jesse Hyatt in Iowa. A couple years later, apparently 20 years later, he submitted it to a contest by the Stark Brothers Nursery. And Stark Brothers Nursery opened in, I think, the 1840s, and they're still in existence today. In fact, if you go on their website, they'll sell you apple rootstocks. So he submitted it to a contest, and when he was calling it the Hawkeye. And the lore is that the president of the company, Clara Stark, bit into it and said, "My, that's delicious." So they renamed it the Stark Delicious. They exhibited it at the World's Fair in 1904. And for 20 years, they spent $750,000. Now imagine that in 2021 dollars. They spent $750,000 in promotion. In 1914, they renamed it the Red Delicious. It's so well known that sometimes they just call it the Delicious. And that was after they had already branded the Golden Delicious. And it ruled through almost 80 years. What happened was it looked so good, it stopped tasting so good. Various mutations happen, and it tends to get mealy on the inside. It has a really thick skin, which is good because it doesn't bruise. But on the other hand, it's hard to bite into. And people finally got tired of it and said, we need different kinds of apples. So here we are with heirloom. Right now, only about 15 varieties, and remember there are 10 or 15,000 varieties, but only 15 varieties comprise about 90% of the apples produced in the country. So what's going on now is a blend of breeding of new apples. In fact, here's one of the most recent out of that University of Minnesota apple breeding program that I was describing in Minnesota. So part of what's going on now is apple improvement, designed splicing of apples. There are others, and most big corporations or big programs do all of this. So this one's run by a university, a public university. This one's run by the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. And the Plant Genetics Resource Unit in Geneva, New York is famous both for creating new apple varieties, counting them and naming them, and also for preserving heirlooms. And then you get small, privately owned, like here's an example, the Temperate Orchard Conservancy, which is called Almaty Farm. And they said that they named that as an homage to Kazakh because it means full of apples. And this one's in Oregon. So what I'm saying is that the conservancy efforts are happening in parallel with the apple improvement effort. And I promised you that I'd show you some pictures. This is from Heritage Farm and Fruit Trees, a heritage producer. And these are some of the examples. This one is famous because supposedly it was Jefferson's famous. This one's that black Oxford I showed you. It has such an unusual color for us when we think about apples. The golden russet. Russet is kind of like a strain of apples. You get a lot of them named apples. And this one just amuses me, partly because of color, but they say it's actually like the flavor I don't like bananas and I love apples, so I don't think I'd be eating this one. If you're interested in seeing a whole exuberance of these names, I would send you to an article that's 25, 45, 55 years old now in our very own names called A Pound of Purest Malus, Please. And in this, John Flanagan just went on and on about lists and names of, as I said, an exuberance of names. And they're just compelling. We have the Milton, we have the Molly's Delicious, we have the Nittany, we have the Redfield, we have the Skinner's Seedling, we have the Spice of Old Virginia, we have that Chenango Strawberry, we have a Chestnut Crab. So if you're interested at all, always check what you want to eat and go for the, I would tell you, go for the heirlooms.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was fascinating. I'll always learn something surprising at one of these meetings, and one of the surprises this time is that the name Golden Delicious is older than the name Red Delicious. I always had assumed the opposite. So. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Yeah, I have a comment from Veronica Robostova. It says, the rector of MSU has an apple tradition. He congratulates first-year students on the 1st of September with the apples from his own garden. His apples are well known in the university. And my question is, culture reflected in apple names?
Oh, thank you for asking that. And especially after having heard your presentation this morning on how culture becomes part of lilac names. Yes, it's very true, because of the names of the people, and also because of, I know with yours, you had some that seemed to be famous personages. In the apple industry, if it's named for a person, it's probably more likely to be named for the person where it was founded. And I can't beat that story, but I will say the university where I teach has about 60 acres. And this being Ohio, there are random fruit trees there. And for several years, I would take to the potluck at the beginning of the year an apple crisp made of apples from one of the old apple trees. But the tree got so bad that 2 years ago, they cut it down. And now if I make them apple crisp, I have to go to the store.
Evangeline Nawako asked, compared to naming roses, could there be similarities between rose names and apple names?
Yes, I imagine there would. I was trying to think if there were any other kinds of fruit or any other kinds of food that we tend to name. There was another article in names in the Names Journal about 5 years ago on brands of wine. And obviously we name wines. We do name roses. To a certain extent, we name tomatoes. We all learned today that we name lilacs. Can anybody else think of other things?
I was going to say that at Washington State University, which is about 90 miles away from here, they have a lot of research on agriculture, and they have a big program on developing different kinds of apples. And of course, the town in the middle of our state, Wenatchee, they call themselves the apple capital of the world, which of course has to compete with people there in Michigan. There's a lot of competition in the development of different apple species, trying to cater to the taste, in the marketplace, in terms of crispness, sweetness, all kinds of measures. And it is quite an endeavor.
Grant, I learned in doing this that Washington State has one of the biggest apple programs in the US. As I said, 32, they grow in 32 of the 50 states, but some of the biggest producers are from Washington.
Yeah. I think Western Michigan is another big area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had a friend who was part of the Iris Association, so I know there's many named varieties of irises, also. And Paige says she and her husband always try new apples they see at the grocery store, and wonders if there are naming patterns for other fruits, And Mirko wonders if there's some apple names that are translated from one language to another.
Oh, that's a great question. One example would be the Fuji. which one of the large apple producers right now is Japan. In the Europe-Asia area, the largest producer is the area that's the former USSR and Poland. But yes, Fuji would be one example. And I don't know, Mirko, whether they actually translate, like, do you translate Golden Delicious into something Italian? I don't know. Oh, Marianne's asking the same thing. Do we translate the names when they're imported or exported? I don't know. Huh.
Well, the thing I noticed about the Washington State research projects there is they really gear the names to taste, apple, crisp. They have a new crisp apple and color. So it's not being named after people or places, which is a change, I think, in nomenclature strategy.
So, well, thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
guess Vicky, we have to ask the people who don't live in North America if they see apples sold by specific names in their grocery stores, in their food stores in whatever country they're in, So.
And I see from Paige that bananas have names.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you. It was delightful being with you.
Okay.
Have an apple.
So thank you really very much, Chris, and thank all of our 4 presentations. We had 4 really different, topics this session, but I think they were all fascinating and important in their own way.